1 in every £1,000 in Monzo was in the zero gravity bank account. If you go to a top university in the UK, that is a life transforming moment. There's loads of data showing these universities boost your long-term earning potential.
Do you ever find that your personal story is almost used against you and your mission?
Joe Seddon launched Zero Gravity from his bedroom, bootstrapping it into a multi-million-pound platform that's helped over 8,000 low-income students reach top universities and careers. Zero Gravity has raised over $6.5 million with over 30 global employers. It's proof that purpose-driven business can scale.
How do we build technology in a way that spots top talent from low-income backgrounds? Ultimately, the biggest competition is not schools, it's not universities, it's people's time and attention. We built a brand that not only our members loved, but had started to create a PR flywheel where we're getting all this earned media that we weren't paying for, but was putting our name out there and building our brand awareness. What you need is people who you've got incredible alignment on mission and values, who essentially give a shit.
Yeah, so usually the way we like to start is working out what problem it is that you sought to solve. Yeah. So let's just dive into a little bit first about the problem that you identified and then how you moved to try and solve it.
Yeah, sure. So Zero Gravity ultimately is about powering students from low opportunity backgrounds into top universities and careers. So the problem we're trying to solve is in the UK, if you grow up in a low income background, you're 6 times less likely to go to a top university than someone who has grown up in a normal background. When you look at access to careers, it compounds, it gets worse and worse and worse. And it sort of creates this quite widespread sentiment that where you grew up, who your parents are, what sort of school you go to, dictates your outcomes in life. That sort of presupposition is almost so widespread that people just take it for granted, like that's just the way things are. But it doesn't have to be that way. Like when you think even of the past 100 years, a country like the UK has changed so much. You know, someone like me from Morley in West Yorkshire, 100 years ago, I would have been working down a pit. That sounds like silly to say now, but like clearly things have changed. Clearly it is possible for people from low opportunity backgrounds now to rise to the top. But we still don't live in a country where there's a level playing field, and that ultimately is the problem Zero Gravity is trying to solve. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but also because there's so much talent and potential in this country which is currently going completely unlocked because of a system that doesn't work for the vast majority of the population.
So what do you identify as being the key drivers for the position to be that way?
So I think there's 3 things that really matter. The most obvious one is money. Money is kind of like the fuel of potential, like when it comes to like living in the right area, or being able to go to the right events, get access to private tutors, textbooks, all the things that people from affluent backgrounds take for granted. And money is the ultimate unlock for all of those things. But there's 2 other things that really matter as well. One is geography. So when you look at a city like London, for instance, there's really vivid inequality here. I was shocked when I first moved to London, and I stayed in Islington for a while, and you had multi-million-pound townhouses on one side of the street, and then some like really troubled council estates on the other side of the street with no gang problems, crime, the sort of crime I hadn't seen growing up in Morley in West Yorkshire. But when you look at London, in many ways it's a social mobility metropolis. London has 29 out of the top 32 boroughs in the UK for social mobility. I think the reason for that is that even if you live in a really disadvantaged background in London, you're still surrounded by opportunity. There's employers on your doorstep. Everyone has a kind of friend or friend of a friend who works on one of these top companies. So even if you don't have much money living here, at least you're living in the midst of the action. Whilst if you're living in a sort of suburb of the UK, or even a big town that doesn't have much opportunity, think your sort of Blackpools, your Coventrys, your Bradfords, even if you come from a middle class background in these areas, there's still hardly any sort of top jobs in the local area. So geography really plays a part too. And the final one is education and schooling. Education is the most obvious solution we know to breaking the link between background and opportunity. If you have really good schools, that educate people well and put them on a level playing field, that should, in theory, solve this entire problem. But we clearly know that there's a massive variation between the quality of schools in the UK. If you go to a state comprehensive in Liverpool, that's a completely different experience to going to a top private school in London. So education plays a massive role. So unless we can sort of solve the money problem, solve the geography problem, and solve the education problem, unfortunately we're going to continue to live in a country where your background for many people does dictate what you can achieve in life.
So how does zero gravity aim to tackle those problems?
So my own lived experience is I grew up in a sort of small town in West Yorkshire, suburban post-industrial town, and I saw firsthand that kind of money, geography and education problem play out in my own life. But I was one of the lucky ones. I was very self-driven. I sort of used the internet to get access to information and people that I couldn't do otherwise in my hometown. And that provided my kind of step out of my situation. I was able to win a place at Oxford University, and that was a life transforming moment for me. But it was also a moment that was very statistically unlikely. Indeed, in the year I graduated from university, there wasn't a single person in the parliamentary constituency that I grew up in that got into Oxford. And it's like 100,000 people in each of these constituencies, but not even a single person from where I lived got in. So I was a sort of statistical outlier. And when I got to the end of university, I reflected on what did I do that made the difference, and what could I have sort of given to my friends who in many ways were just as talented and driven as I was, to give them the same chance to get into one of these institutions. And I realised that for me, technology was my big unlock. So I started to think, how do we build technology in a way that spots top talent from low-income backgrounds and gets them into these institutions? So what I built from my bedroom originally was an app. And the first thing the app did was actually talent spot students from low-income backgrounds. Many people in the country, young people, don't even realise they've got the potential to go to these institutions. All they can see is what's immediately in front of them in their school and their hometown. So we developed an algorithm to essentially spot the students in schools across the UK who are performing well above their peers, who are from low-income backgrounds, and we sort of give them the proverbial tap on the shoulder. They're telling them at the age of 16, we believe you have what it takes to go the distance, to do something that someone in your family has never done before. So we built technology to identify students, and the next stage is how do you actually get them in, tangibly change their chances of breaking into these top universities and careers. And essentially what we did is we took solutions that we know work in the real world: mentoring, access to great content, feeling part of a community, access to exclusive opportunities, and we just built them all into a single unified app experience, available anytime, anywhere, in your pocket at all times. That makes it really easy to do this thing. You don't have to rely on your school to invite a speaker from that business into the assembly. You don't have to rely on your uncle to find a mentor from his business who can meet you in a cafe every couple of weeks. We just made it really, really easy and accessible for people to access the things that we know work. And for Gen Z, ultimately the biggest competition for a company like ours is not schools, it's not universities, it's not charities running programs, it's people's time and attention on social media. So essentially we try to create the app that, rather than sort of doom scrolling on TikTok, you can instead use zero gravity for a couple of times a day to unlock your potential.
Before we move on, and it's a little bit off topic, but you did mention it and you referred to yourself as an outlier. Do you ever find that your personal story is almost used against you and your mission? Some people might say, well, hang on, the system can't be that broken because you're proof that you moved through it. Do you ever find that you ever get any kind of pushback in that capacity?
No one's saying that social mobility is impossible. Like I said, if you look at the UK today versus 100 years ago, clearly things have really tangibly changed, but they haven't changed as much as people necessarily think. That in fact, that social mobility, which is just a posh word for essentially how much does your background dictate your chances in life, it's stagnated since the 1980s. So we've had 40 years where things haven't really changed. in terms of you from a low-income background, can you get into these top institutions? And my story, I'm quite conscious of. Like when I was growing up, this was not something I spoke about. Like it wasn't cool when I was at school to talk about being from a single-parent family. And when I was at university, it wasn't cool to talk about going to a state school when you're surrounded by people who'd gone to like really well-known, well-established institutions. So I was almost like not necessarily embarrassed, but I kind of stored all of this up within me when I was going on my journey. I was only after the fact, after I left university, I sort of looked back and realised just how big the obstacles were that I overcame versus a lot of my peers. And what I wanted to do was find a way to almost identify the next generation of people like me, but speak to them on the same level. So rather than sort of have that typical sort of philanthropic approach of reaching down to people, calling them disadvantaged, working class, we're going to pull you up to our level. Instead of sort of having that approach, which I think is like deeply alienating, that undermines your sense of dignity as a young person, instead make it about people's talent. Like we're not pulling you up because it's the nice thing to do. We're identifying you because we think you are the next generation of talent that should be creating the businesses of the future, leading academia, in government, and that sort of more positive messaging rather than the kind of deficit mentality of how government usually speaks to young people, I think allows you to identify people who traditionally wouldn't engage in this kind of initiative.
Before we move on to the team that you put together to create the company, I think it'd be useful to establish exactly in your own words what you mean by opportunity, and also what a low income family looks like, and how you would identify a child, say, from a low income family as opposed to a different type of family.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, we take a sort of algorithmic approach to identifying people from low opportunity areas. So we look at a basket of different kind of measures, but we do things in a slightly weird way, taking approaches actually private companies have pioneered to do very different things. So for instance, modern day advertising, most big consumer companies use socioeconomic data to target customers. Now, if your brand only wants to advertise to sort of affluent customers who'd be interested in buying luxury items, it's very wasteful and inefficient to target your advertisements in areas where none of those people exist, and vice versa. So all big consumer companies leverage postcode level data to target the right socioeconomic groups, and we've used that same approach to actually identify people from those low income backgrounds who are being ignored. So taking something that's using consumer for a very different purpose and applying it for social good. But we also look at things like how good people's school is. Like, it's never the sort of thing you'd see on a CV. You just see a school name. We've got so much data about the school students go to and how that changes their chances in life. Just by having that data, you can find out really interesting things about a person, like how good was their performance at school versus their peers, and how much progress the students make at that school. And when you put all this together, you get a really data-driven assessment of how disadvantaged someone is and how good their performance is in context. And for young people, performance in context is the key thing that really matters, because if you're a university admitting a student or an employer admitting a graduate, you're not looking for the finished sort of article. You're not looking for polish, you're looking for potential. So how someone's performed in context is much more important to predict that than someone's just absolute achievement without any context of the environment which was achieved. So that's how we look at kind of low income and disadvantage. In terms of opportunity, ultimately you can have a sort of philosophical discussion about what that means. I take a very crude approach, which for many low income students, often that means breaking the cycle of economic disadvantage. It comes down to money at the end of the day. Like, can you end up in a better financial position than your parents? That is what most 16-year-olds automatically jump to when they think about social mobility. They don't care about the philosophical arguments about happiness or satisfaction. Often money really, really matters. So we look at getting people into opportunities or institutions that statistically boost their lifetime earnings. If you go to a top university in the UK, that is a life-transforming moment, not just because it's a nice achievement, but because there's loads of data showing these universities boost your long-term earning potential. The same of getting into a top graduate job. And if you go to work for a Morgan Stanley or a KPMG or a big tech company like Snapchat, again, that's not just a nice achievement on your LinkedIn profile. That fundamentally changes the trajectory of earnings for the rest of your life. That's not just about your salary today, that's how it compounds over a 30 or 40 year period. So that's what we look at when it comes to opportunity. Are the places that we're getting our students into boosting the long-term income potential? Because if we're doing that, we're breaking the cycle of disadvantage, not just for that person, but for the next generation of their family.
If you've taken something from this, an insight you've used or could have used to refine, design or scale your business, hit subscribe.
Ironically, because this is free, most people won't.
Studies show that if we charged even £1, you'd be more likely to take action because you'd feel the value.
But we don't do that. So if this helped you, that one click of support helps us to keep doing it and continue delivering business insights every week.
Wow, I mean, awesome, really, really cool. And now I want to talk about the early team that you put this company with together, because, you know, I agree with what you're saying. It sounds like a very big challenge to take on. And I noticed that your studies at Oxford weren't technological. You weren't hands-on with tech, but you built an app nonetheless with a limited budget in your bedroom. Did you put together a small team, or was it just yourself? Could you take us back to those early days and how you decided who to work with and on what?
Sure, so I was a sort of semi-technical founder, so you're right, I didn't study computer science at university. I studied philosophy, politics and economics, which I think makes you an expert in bullshitting, essentially, which as a startup founder is not a necessarily bad skill to have. Now, you have to spend a lot of time, especially at the beginning of your journey, essentially storytelling and inspiring people and sort of being very intellectually agile. Knowing kind of a little bit about a lot of subjects is actually quite a key skill. But I had sort of self-taught front-end software engineering skills that I just learnt growing up, and I was really interested in technology. It was difficult not to be in my sort of generation with all these like cool new apps coming out, whether it was Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp growing up, and then Uber and delivery when I was at university. It was difficult not to be inspired by the innovation that was coming out of Silicon Valley. So I self-taught myself these skills. But when it came to actually building something from nothing as a semi-technical founder, it's difficult to appreciate just how difficult that is to do, because even if you can spin up a MVP, a basic platform to start testing your concept, how do you brand it? How do you get distribution? How do you create that feedback loop of getting those consumer insights? Like, these are all things that I'd never done before, and I just essentially learned on the job. And I was very cognizant that I was a naive young founder, and I started this company out my childhood bedroom when I was 21 years old. So when I was first assembling a team, essentially what I looked for was people like me who were young, sort of had something to prove, a chip on their shoulder, and ultimately generalists, because I'm a strong believer that at the sort of very embryonic stage of your company, what you don't need is people who are incredibly skilled and experienced. What you need is people who you've got incredible alignment on mission and values, who essentially give a shit, who, if this goes well, are going to kind of get a disproportionate benefit from that and are willing to go with you on a journey. Those are the people you need to sort of build something from nothing. So essentially I just looked for people like me. So my first hires were essentially other 21, 22, 23-year-olds who had little in the way of experience, little in the way of kind of traditional skills and competencies, but believed in the mission. I felt they had a set of values that aligned well with my own. And ultimately, a lot of these people were quite chippy as well. They had a chip on their shoulder about something, they had something to prove, and ultimately, I felt like this person, when sort of shit hits the fan and you have those bad days that you often do have as a startup, they're going to be with me in the trenches and help sort this stuff out. And that is the kind of hire I think you need for person 2, 3, 4 of your startup. And
so did you put that team together when you first built the app? When you talk about building the app for £200, was how soon after that did you start to assimilate a team, and how did you compensate them?
So I graduated from university in July of 2018, and it wasn't until July of 2019 that I was actually able to pay myself as a founder. So I had a sort of a year where Zero Gravity was literally in bedroom mode. I was uncompensated as a founder. I didn't have any employees. So like getting through that year ultimately required just my time, effort, blood, sweat, being a generalist, sort of attending to all the different components of building a business. But in July 2019, I was lucky enough to raise some external funding. I found an angel investor who committed to investing £100,000 in my company, which at the time felt like a monstrously large amount. I'd never seen any figure anywhere close to that in a bank account before. I think the biggest figure I'd seen before that was my student loan dropping in the first term of university. So it seemed like a monstrously large amount of money at the time. But what that investor also gave me is he came on as a mentor as well. Like he was someone who'd previously built a company from a laboratory at university into a company that listed on the stock market in the UK. So it wasn't just his investment, it was also his time and mentorship as well, which to me as a kind of young founder at that point was like absolutely unquantifiably powerful as a way to grow the company. And then I was in a position where I could actually start hiring people. And like I said, the 100K seemed like a monstrous amount of money at the time. Doesn't get you that far in terms of startup compensation. So I couldn't hire your kind of seasoned executives from Google or Uber or Meta, and even if I wanted to. So in many ways, I was constrained by economics of only having to, or being able to hire young people and grads. But in many ways, that constraint, I feel like, was a huge benefit, because it would have been completely the wrong decision to do what many startup founders do, which is splurge money on trying to find your kind of seasoned experts who look fantastic on a slide deck, but often don't have the experience of actually working at a really early stage startup where there's no HR processes, there's no documentation, that there's no kind of well-established ways of doing things. Like you're literally building stuff from the ground up, and if you've spent your entire career working in big companies where everything is processized and there's a person responsible for every single tiny little bit of the machine, adapting to early stages is almost impossible. So the economic constraint, I think, accidentally led to actually the right kind of hiring decisions.
So continuing down the road of economic constraints, outside of your first hires, how did you choose to spend that budget that you had?
One of the biggest financial decisions I took at the beginning of the journey that was quite controversial at the time was I actually paid just over a 5-figure amount to a brand agency to do a brand identity creation exercise. Now, when I first pitched this to the sort of board of directors I established at the time and said, look, we're going to spend a 5-figure amount on a brand identity creation exercise, I had the sort of inevitable question of, why are you spending 10K on designing a logo and a colour scheme and a typeface? And people often, like they take brands for granted. Like once you have one, everyone kind of appreciates it and it's great. But at the beginning of your journey, when you're building something from scratch, people don't appreciate just how important it is to actually be really conscious about the brand you're trying to build. So that was a big early financial decision. And essentially what we did there is, before I sort of released like anything into the public domain with a brand I was willing to stand behind, I sort of did this exercise where ultimately I tried to define in the clearest possible terms, what is the mission of Zero Gravity? Like, what are the fundamental values of this company? Like, what's the foundational beliefs? And then once you've done that work, it's really easy to then translate that into things like a logo, a colour scheme, typefaces. Like when you look at our logo now with its kind of the impossible Z shape and it's like really strong, bold font, that comes out of the kind of values that we're trying to translate through that. So you've got to put in the work to define who you are before you can decide what sort of clothes you want to put on. So building a brand is not about just coming up with a cool logo and a typeface. It's putting in the almost the philosophical work of, I'm going to sit down and get absolute clarity about the kind of company I'm trying to build. And it's only with that clarity that you can then ask your consumers the question of, is this something that you want to buy into? If you don't know who you are yourself, how can you ask anyone else to buy into what you're building? So brand identity sounds boring, sounds technical, sounds maybe even a bit profligate for an early stage company, but I think was absolutely the right decision to actually give us a brand that was worth buying into.
We'll dive into brand a bit later because I always love talking about that. But something I wanted to know, so obviously you chose, and it is, I think it is quite fair to say, quite a risky thing to invest so heavily in branding that early. Risky in the sense of it can have a little bit of backlash. So when you said that a few of your directors thought maybe it was not the best way to spend your money, hopefully, and sounds like you proved them wrong in the end, but I know a lot of people who think, I'm going to start a company and invest a lot of money in something fun like branding and things like that. People might sort of say it's not the way to go. What would you say is the most important thing for anyone listening now? Where should they allocate those really limited resources they have at the beginning?
I think for any consumer company, they're trying to appeal to individuals directly, having a strong brand is a non-negotiable. Like when I started in 2018, obviously as a kind of tech software company, technology, having a great product that actually works, has the feature set you say it does, that's important. But that is something that now in 2025 it's not necessarily become commoditized, but the barriers to entry have massively decreased. Like there was no vibe coding or AI agents when I started Zero Gravity in 2018. In 2025, you can spin up actually a really high quality MVP now. Now it may be in a couple of days, but what you can't do is in a couple of days spin up a brand that people are gonna not only know but love and buy into. So I think a lot of founders make a kind of typical mistake, which is that they assume that if they build a fantastic product, they will automatically become an overnight success story and they'll magically have tens of thousands of people signing up. The sort of social network, Mark Zuckerberg style cultural fairy tale of you launch a fantastic product from your bedroom and suddenly it goes viral overnight. Not true for the vast majority of founders, not even true for Facebook. It took Facebook years to go from the kind of college campus social network to the mass market platform we have today. So you really need to think deeply about brand marketing and distribution, because that is the one thing where there's still a premium and a differentiation between companies, whilst building tech products now is something that is far more accessible to any founder. So I think it's more important now than ever before.
Totally agree. So can we revisit the time when you secured your first, I say customer typically, but in your situation when you were able to generate your first revenue for the company?
Sure. So we've got quite a interesting business model, which is we're a B2C platform insofar as we sign up students and get them into university and careers, but that's completely free at the point of use. We don't charge the students a dime because we're working with people from low opportunity backgrounds. So our platform is fundamentally B2C, but our business model is B2B. And the sort of organisations we typically work with are big employers who want to recruit the best talent in the UK. And they also want to find people from low income backgrounds, not just because it's the right thing to do, but often they've got data showing that those people are the most productive people in their organisation. A lot of raw talent, a lot of resilience. If you can find that diamond in the rough, that person's going to go on to be a massive asset to the business. So we work with employers, we work with universities as well to help them recruit. And we also work with some sort of local governments and school in the UK who want to boost their level of social mobility. The first organisation, employer that we signed up was HSBC, massive global bank. Now that's quite rare for a startup to do because enterprise sales is quite tricky at the best of times. But enterprise sales as a super early stage startup led by a sort of fresh-faced 22-year-old at the time is a different level of difficulty. But the reason we were able to do that is ultimately we had a track record. Before that I'd had 18 months of data showing that we could sign people up to the platform, that they'd engage with it, and ultimately we could get results. We built a brand that not only our members loved, but had started to create a PR flywheel. No, I think in the couple of months before we signed the contract with HSBC, we'd been like featured in the Sunday Times, BBC News, the Telegraph. So by building a brand with a really clear, distinctive message, we built this flywheel where we're getting all this earned media that we weren't paying for, but was putting our name out there and building our brand awareness with sort of thought leaders and decision makers in these big enterprise companies, the sort of people who I couldn't reach myself, but by building that PR flywheel, I was able to get through those doors. And ultimately, as well, there's a huge component of this which is about people and networking. But when people think about B2B sales, that they often misconceive that as selling to some kind of abstract organization, but ultimately organizations are just associations of people. So like if you're doing B2B sales, you're ultimately still selling to a person or a group of people, not some kind of abstract legal entity. And at HSBC, I was lucky that I was able to get an introduction to a guy there who was their global head of talent. He was from a low-income background himself, so he kind of emotionally resonated with what we were doing. And he was a little bit of a sort of thought leader, risk taker, that sort of internal entrepreneur almost inside a big corporate, who was willing to almost put his own reputation on the line to kind of do something which on paper would have looked incredibly risky for an organisation like HSBC to give a 5-figure contract to not only an early stage company, but one run by a 22-year-old. So like finding the right people in these organisations is incredibly important, never more so than right at the start of your journey, where ultimately you have to find people who emotionally buy into your idea, because for any risk-averse organisation, they're always going to have a reason to say no at the beginning of the journey.
Totally. And how did that introduction come about?
So that came about actually as part of the media flywheel in many ways. So the media flywheel connected me with an investor who invested in my organisation, and then he knew someone at HSBC who introduced us to this person. So without creating that media flywheel, that ultimately traces back to that brand identity exercise that I did in the year before that, none of that would have happened. So if that's not a kind of clear example of why brand is so important to invest in, I don't know what is. Like, we would never have got our first enterprise customer without doing that brand identity exercise.
I mean, your first revenues from HSBC, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, it was, I couldn't quite believe it at the time, to be honest, but nowadays we've got over 30 big corporates we work with. Like sometimes I'll walk into Canary Wharf and it's quite weird looking around at the buildings and thinking, oh, we work with that one, that one, that one. Like your Morgan Stanleys, your KPMGs, those sort of companies. But ultimately, like many things, it's a sheep market. Getting the first 1, 2, 3, and 4 is really, really difficult. But once you've got a couple of big names, you've retained them, you've actually delivered what you said you're going to deliver and got outcomes, it's much easier to sign up more enterprise partners. So enterprise sales, really, really difficult to break into at the beginning, but if you can do a good job, actually you can proliferate your products much quicker than other industries, because there is a natural kind of sheep herding effect that often happens with those big companies.
You mentioned earlier about raising 100K from an angel investor. Have you done any more raises? And if so, why did you do them?
Yeah, so we've raised £6.5 million now in total since the start of my journey. So if you thought that 100K was monstrously large at the time, like at one point, I probably shouldn't say this, but we actually did our seed funding round in a Monzo bank account back in December of 2021. £3.5 million dropped into a Monzo bank account in the space of 24 hours. And at the time, I looked it up, at the time, based on the amount of deposits in the entire Monzo platform, there was one in every £1,000 in Monzo was in the zero gravity bank account back in December of 2021. So that was a kind of quite interesting moment, because it's like, wow, this is a really large amount of money in any objective terms. But I think the thing with raising investment is I've seen a massive culture shift over the past 3 or 4 years. Like when I first started my journey, sort of 2018 to 2021, it really was a kind of just accepted practice to try and raise as much capital as possible on the highest valuation as possible to kind of, to put it crudely, get the kind of sexiest article in TechCrunch announcing your funding round that you could possibly get. I think since the sort of funding environment started to tighten in 2022, that created a catalyst for a lot of founders to kind of look at their business and reappraise. Are we actually raising capital for the right reasons? And also, if I'm a founder and I'm raising a round of funding at a particular valuation, am I sort of storing up trouble for the future by raising too much money that I don't know how to spend, and also raising a valuation that I can't grow into, which is going to lead to me shooting myself in the foot in 2 years' time? So I've seen a real kind of vibe shift with regards to funding. And my lesson for founders here is, if you want to successfully not just raise funding now, but put yourself in the best position to raise funding in the future, you need to have a really clear plan about not only how you're going to spend that funding, but what milestones and outcomes it's going to help you achieve. That sounds incredibly basic, but you'd be shocked. There's so many founders who literally just have a mentality of, I will raise as much as possible to sound as cool as possible. Like, that is a recipe for disaster. So when you present it to investors, clearly show how that money is going to be broken down and spent. And sort of, you've got to draw the line in the sand saying, when I raise this money, in 18 months' time, 2 years, I will have achieved this, this, and this. And the reason that's important is it will then enable me to do this, this, and this. So having those milestones, having those breakdowns is really important, not only to complete your investment rounds, but make sure you're not storing up trouble for the future.
Yeah, that sounds like very good advice. Of course, once you've achieved the investment round and you've got the money in a Monzo account or another account, you then have to worry about the day-to-day managing of those finances and making sure they're spent in the places you need to spend them to achieve the milestones you've set out. Have you got any advice or best practices you could recommend for how you manage finances on a day-to-day basis?
So if you're a young founder, you should lean into financial responsibility and governance rather than lean away from it. People often see having a board of directors, having policies, and having formal procedures as kind of unnecessary bureaucracy that kind of stymies a startup culture. It doesn't need to be that way if you build those things in the right way. And in many ways, as a young founder, naturally people are going to perceive you to be dangerous, risky, and naive. And the best way you can allay those concerns is by leaning into them rather than leaning away from them. So some of the things I did at the start of my journey was, like, when we raised the big round of funding, I did the basics. I had an independent accountant who we worked with. We produced monthly management accounts, which were sent to the board so they knew how we were spending the money. I had all the right processes, setting an annual budget, reforecasting it, getting it approved, regular board meetings, just all that basic stuff, which sounds very mundane, but a lot of founders just don't bother to do it because they see it as needless bureaucracy. And then, to use a very specific example, thinking about some of the boring risk stuff as well, regarding how do you make sure that money you've raised is actually secure. I was shocked in 2022, 2023, how many early stage startups have stuffed their funding that they'd raised in Silicon Valley Bank, which overnight went kaboosh. And suddenly there was all these founders who were locked out of bank accounts that had millions of pounds in and weren't able to make payroll. There was a lot of sympathy in the startup sector at the time for what happened there. But ultimately, that was really, really poor and, to be honest, quite negligent financial practices from a lot of startups who never should have put millions of pounds in a bank that had a pretty wobbly credit rating and were amounts that were way above the government insured amount. So just some of the basic stuff, like make sure your money is only in AAA rated banks and making sure you're spreading it across multiple institutions to prevent a kind of default or credit risk on those banks. Sounds like the boring, tedious stuff until something goes wrong. And then if you haven't done that stuff, you're the one who's in the shit where you've just lost millions of pounds of investor funding. And I was just lucky that I was alive to that stuff at the beginning of my journey. And I had a good accountant and a good board who were sort of quite hard on those concerns. And I just put that stuff in place. And that's why in 22, 23, we didn't have a single dime in Silicon Valley Bank, whilst I knew lots of my friends who ran startups literally couldn't pay payroll for a month as a result of that mistake.
I'm wondering, I think that's really solid advice. I'm just wondering, and maybe it's intertwined with a bit of, imposter syndrome that founders have, but at what point should they implement that practice? Because I imagine a lot of people are sat here listening and thinking, well, okay, if you're talking about people with millions of pounds in a bank, okay, let's make sure we've got some policies in place. But I think what you're trying to say is you should think about this stuff from the start. Is that right?
As early as possible, like certainly as soon as you take on external capital, you've increased the risk to both you as a company and a founder, because suddenly you've created this, like to use the technical phrase, fiduciary responsibility to shareholders in your company. Like you need to make sure that you've got their best interests at heart and you're running the company based on the plan that you pitch them. So as soon as you raise external capital, you should be putting these procedures in place. And if you put them in place as early as possible as well, it actually is more time efficient because, like to give you an example, audited accounts. It's not sexy for a startup to say they're going to spend a couple of grand per year employing a third-party auditor to go through their financial statements and check that they're doing things in the right way and that there's like no fraud or bad financial practice in the company. And like when we started doing that in 2022, like I thought, oh, this is a bit of a ball ache. I wish I didn't have to do this. But by doing stuff at the beginning of your journey, you catch the mistakes you're making, or like we're not reconciling this in the right way, or we're not valuing this. And by getting the mistakes out early, you prevent yourself making much bigger mistakes in the future. Whilst if you have all these bad practices that you don't address at the beginning of your journey, they compound and compound and compound over time, and then they become much more difficult to actually change further down the track. So I would encourage founders, put these processes in place from day one of raising external capital. Even the stuff that sounds tedious and boring is going to save you a lot of time if you put it in now, rather than waiting for something to go wrong in 3 years' time.
You spoke earlier about how you invested quite heavily in your sort of brand identity in the early days. How has that translated now to sort of brand building, marketing, partnerships? How much emphasis does Zero Gravity put on that kind of stuff?
Sure, so like you've got to get your brand building right before you can even think about marketing and distribution. Like if you have a brand that people ultimately don't want to buy into, it's impossible to market anything. So yeah, 2018, 2019 was very much about brand building for Zero Gravity, getting that identity clear and starting to evolve the brand based on the insights that we're getting from consumers. But then marketing at that point becomes really important. And for startups, like you are economically constrained. So unless you have a business model where you've got a really high lifetime value, ideally one that is really skewed towards the short term, it's really difficult to justify doing a lot of paid media and advertising. And I personally probably made some mistakes by going a little bit too heavy on paid early doors, because I just wanted quick wins on kind of acquisition of consumers without necessarily putting in enough of the legwork on actually getting the organic parts of my marketing strategy right first and the sort of top of funnel parts right on building awareness. So I would strongly discourage founders away from paid media and advertising unless you have a very specific business financial model that justifies that, because you've got a very high lifetime value. Might work for a consumer company, but for companies like ours, I'd dissuade people from doing it, because ultimately paid advertising is a tax on not having a good product. Like if your product is genuinely really good and you've defined your brand really well and you've got a good marketing strategy, you should be able to organically grow that. And it's not going to be easy, but you shouldn't pull the simple lever of paid advertising. So like to give you an example, some of the bitty stuff we did in the early days to get our initial acquisition is we used to pay very small amounts to meme accounts on Instagram who are making memes about exams in the UK. And these kids would create these memes about Zero Gravity in the sort of same style as their account and post them. And I was literally paying these people like 15 quid a pop to create these memes. So I'm not sure if that's defined as like micro-influencer marketing or something else, but that's how we got our sort of first organic acquisition channel built up, from people essentially putting these memes out on their accounts, and then organically there was other kids who were then posting about Zero Gravity as a result of that. And like those things might be seen as growth hacks, but actually that was the sort of first embryonic stage of actually creating a proper organic marketing strategy where we try to find things to create that, that viral growth that all startup founders they'll want to achieve, but doing it by experimenting with like different organic strategies, which sometimes it didn't seem very sexy. Not as sexy as setting up some really clever, meta advertising strategies. Sometimes as basic as literally contacting a 15-year-old and saying, will you create a meme for me on your meme page that has 100,000 of my relevant customers on it. So yeah, I'd avoid paid advertising as long as you possibly can as a startup.
I think it's a really interesting point about how you use organic advertising to capture the consumer. I'm conscious, of course, that you have those two halves of your business where you're working with the large enterprises and you're also trying to capture the consumer. When you take on things like creating the memes that are shared within the young people, how conscious do you have to be that your brand is still represented in a way that's, aligns, I suppose, with some of the values of the enterprise companies you're working with? Do you know where I'm coming from?
Yes, that's a really good question. Like ultimately, your brand has to stand for something. If you try and appeal to everyone, you're appealing to no one at the end of the day. So like we made a decision early doors of our brand that ultimately we were going to be a B2C youth brand. We were going to try and reflect the values of our sort of 16 to 18-year-old members who are from low-income backgrounds in the UK, but they want to defy the odds. They're ambitious. They've got imposter syndrome, but they've got these dreams of a future that currently doesn't seem possible. So we really lent into that, and we sort of had a basic strategy, which was we're not going to try and speak directly to the sort of the corporates, the universities, local government. Instead, we're going to try and build a brand halo where those organisations see that we have a kind of competitive advantage on speaking to that Gen Z audience, which they can't reach and they don't understand. And that's how we're going to draw them to us, not because we're going to start speaking their corporate lingo. So if you are a company like ours that has to face into multiple audiences, I'd say the biggest mistake you can make is trying to appeal for everyone. You have to essentially define who are your primary audiences, lean into them as much as possible, and then create a strategy where the other audiences sort of benefit from the halo effect of appealing to that primary audience in a really compelling way. But where you can sort of correct some of the tensions that might come out of that is in sales. So like our strategy for bringing on corporates is essentially sales-led rather than marketing-led. Like our lead funnel is not necessarily, it's not advertising, it's not even necessarily organic marketing for the acquisition. It's our salespeople in our organisation that are going out there to the right events, speaking to the right people. And if you have a good sales process, you can sort of correct some of those tensions because you've literally got someone speaking to a person in the organisation able to clarify some of their misconceptions or misapprehensions. So don't try to appeal to everyone, appeal to your primary audience and try and build that brand halo effect would be my advice.
Awesome. I think you've shared some really, really useful insights on how to build a brand. I want to talk now, if you can, about the culture internally of your business. As you've hired the team that you've built, what kind of values do you look out for in the people that you hire? And what advice would you have as the business has got bigger to other entrepreneurs as to how to maintain that culture that you're trying to embed in the business as it scales?
So, as any CEO will tell you, people are everything. Like people are your biggest asset as a business, even if it's not on your balance sheet. And no startup idea or strategy is so good that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that it will become a successful business. Ultimately, it's people executing great strategies and great ideas that build a great business. So you cannot succeed as a startup unless you recruit the right people working the right way together. And like when I started to think about the culture I wanted to build at Zero Gravity, I essentially sat down and I thought, if Zero Gravity was like a Sims character, what sort of character would this person be? Is this a kind of stroppy person, or is this a kind of optimistic person? Do they have a sense of like their integrity and hard work, or are they more flamboyant and creative? You have to almost imagine your company as a person and then describe what sort of person it is. So I did that exercise and I sat down. I came up with these 4 values. And the thing about values is that people on LinkedIn constantly throw around this word in a very vacuous way. Your values should be things that some people will buy into, but also some people will really not like. If a value is the sort of thing that everyone nods their head and says, that's good, that means it's got no real substance behind it. To have substance, it needs to be somewhat controversial. So I came up with these 4 values of things that I personally really liked. I thought they were really important for building the kind of company I wanted to build, but were things that I could imagine putting on our website and some people coming onto the page thinking, I don't like the sound of this at all. So just to give you one of them, for instance, stand up straight is one of our values, which is it's essentially a metaphor for being very direct and undiplomatic, meaning what you say and saying what you mean. As a northerner, like instinctively I like this value because the people from Yorkshire are known for speaking their mind and not beating around the bush about what they think. I think that's a really important value for a startup because stuff is constantly going wrong. You have to have a culture of hard work and high expectations because you define the odds. If you're too nice and diplomatic about things, then you don't actually solve problems. You can get away with acting like that in a big company because everyone's almost in a masquerade ball at these big companies. Everyone's sort of putting on this performance in the way they speak and try not to rub people up the wrong way because you never know who's sitting on the compensation and promotion committee, who's going to get you your next promotion. But in a startup, diplomacy is the death of progress. You need straight talkers, people who are willing to ruffle feathers to get things done. And that doesn't mean allowing people to be dickheads for no reason, but it doesn't mean creating a culture where people accept people being straight talking. Now that is a value which I like, probably a lot of people living in startup world probably like, but I can think of so many of my friends or people in my family who would not want to work in an environment and culture that was like that. And for me, that's a good thing because that means that value has real substance behind it. So you've got to work out what those values are, make sure they've got substance, and also I'd advise giving them cool metaphorical names as well, because then they become memorable catchphrases which everyone in the company can recite, and they almost become like an asset for your business. If you're using the same names as everyone else, like compassion, integrity, hard work, then it's got no real differentiation to it, and people aren't going to recite that like it's some kind of special law that applies to your company. So that's how I'd recommend sort of going about defining what your culture is at the early stages.
Yeah, they often say you have to offend 80% to find your 20%, right? And I think it's quite interesting because I've commented on a few sort of social mobility topics recently, and although it's something that we all agree is something that should be improved, it's actually an incredibly divisive topic, which is why at the beginning of the podcast I asked you if you'd had any pushback. I'm just wanted to go back into that again and just work out whether or not you've noticed any sort of cultural shifts that are pushing against what you're moving towards.
I think because zero gravity has always defined itself in terms of talent and trying to power people from low-income backgrounds into top institutions rather than just kind of bashing the system for the way it is. We're probably less controversial or divisive than some other brands who just constantly complain about what privileged people are able to get away with in society and try and tear down the system. So I think that's why we haven't really had a huge amount of pushback. I think where I've started to see a little bit of the tension is that when your product almost becomes too good, when you start actually reshaping the demographics of some of these companies and universities, that's when you start to get sharp-elbowed people saying, wait a second, that's my son or daughter who's no longer able to get into Oxford University, or that's my son and daughter who they might have been at Goldman Sachs 2 years ago but now can't get in because there's a really intelligent lad from East Ham in London who's now getting that job instead. So I don't think that's necessarily made us divisive, but it has made people more wary of the impact we're having on some of these institutions, because even though we're still an early stage startup, we've got over 1,000 students now into Oxford and Cambridge University. Like 1 in 4 of all of the kids at Oxford and Cambridge who come from disadvantaged backgrounds are coming through our platform. Like when I was at Oxford and Cambridge back in 2018, it was roughly 50-50 state versus private schools. And nowadays it's closer to 70-30. So like the work that we've done and that other people have done is actually fundamentally shifted the demographics of those universities. And for me, that's a good thing, because there's lots of talented people now from low opportunity backgrounds getting into those universities who just wouldn't of 10 years ago. But obviously that started to upset a certain set of people, because advantages that they would have had historically are now being taken away. But the reason I sort of sleep easy at night is those advantages aren't being taken away due to quotas or policy changes. They're being taken away because finally we're starting to level the playing field for talented kids who didn't have the same resources of those people, who are beating those people now in a fair competition. And that for me is the right thing, and something that everyone should be able to reconcile themselves to. So we haven't had tremendous pushback, but I think the more success you have of actually changing demographics, the more you're creating the risk of the tall poppy syndrome at the end of the day.
Yeah. Just want to move on now to AI, and wondering how sort of zero gravity incorporates AI into what you do, or do you do that at all or not?
Yep, so our product roadmap has completely shifted over the past 2 years. We were actually one of the first businesses in the UK to incorporate the Open AI API into our platform. Like we did that in Q1 of 2023. So literally just 3 or 4 months after the launch of GPT-3. Like I could see the power of AI straight away, because I'm a massive nerd. And as soon as GPT-3 came out, I used it and I was like, wow, this is a massive step change in what you can actually achieve with AI. It's not perfect, it hallucinates. Back then it didn't have access to the internet, you couldn't upload files, but it was able to do basic tasks which 3 or 4 years ago would have taken me 30 minutes in 10 seconds. So I could see the potential straight away, and we got on the innovation curve as quickly as we could. And like lots of companies, the first thing we did is literally we just created a ChatGPT wrapper. We just integrated ChatGPT directly into our platform. We branded it as our own AI agent, and we just prompted our members to use it at particular times, when they were designing their personal statement, their CV. So it was a pretty basic integration of AI, but essentially what we did is we just made it accessible to members and prompted them when they might want to use it. Over time, we've increasingly embedded AI under the hood. So rather than users having to engage with a chatbot, there's some activities now which are done with AI on our platform automatically, where the user doesn't even know that it's AI that's building or sort of creating the outcomes. So like when it comes to things like matching mentees and mentors on our platform, AI is involved in the process of creating the best mentoring matches. When it comes to like moderating our community on the platform, like we don't have a community manager who's moderating every post that a 17-year-old puts on there. We've got AI that automatically flags content. So just all these small, sometimes very unsexy things where we've built AI under the hood, but it's allowing us to do things now that we just couldn't do 3 years ago unless we had a physical human being doing some of that work. So it's a key part of our product, and from looking at our roadmap for the rest of this year, almost every single feature that we're building now has at least part of its component, which is an AI component. So I'm really, really excited. But on a broader level, I am quite concerned about the impact that AI could have on the kind of issue or the problem that we're trying to address, which is like we potentially could be entering a world where people from rich, affluent backgrounds in the UK have a AI agent in their pocket, which is 5 times better than an AI agent of a low-income student. Like if you think about like the status quo nowadays, if you're rich, you can afford to go to a better school, private tutors, extracurricular activities, but the technology you have access to is actually remarkably similar. And most young people in the UK have a smartphone. Someone might have an iPhone 10 and someone might have an iPhone 7, but like there isn't a huge gap in digital capability. If we move into a world where the better, more powerful AI models are priced appropriately and only certain groups can access them whilst everyone else is on the kind of basic version, we're going to massively magnify social inequalities, because you've now got in your pocket something that is 10 times better than that private tutor that your parents are paying 100 quid an hour for. It's available anytime, anywhere. So I think there's a really big question here of, is AI going to level the playing field, or is it going to magnify existing inequalities? And I think the two things that are going to dictate which way it goes is one around energy and compute. Like, can we bring the price of using these models as low as possible, because then that makes it easier to give them to more people for a lower price. So questions around energy and data centers are going to be really, really important for dictating that. And then the second one, I think, goes to government intervention, which is government going to get ahead of the curve on making sure people in low-income areas and state schools are adopting AI? That the United Arab Emirates has just rolled out ChatGPT for free across the entire country. They're taking this problem seriously. They're saying, we're going to make sure everyone has equitable access to AI. I'm not currently convinced that the government's going to be ahead of the curve on making sure AI is inside the classroom of every single state school in the UK. I know the private schools in the UK are going to be implementing AI in the classroom because they're switched on and they've got resources to do so. I'm not currently convinced the state school's going to be ahead of the curve. So unless government is kind of looking at this right now and thinking what to do, we massively risk a social mobility disaster. In the same way policymakers kind of were asleep at the wheel when it came to social media and only reacted when it was too late, I think we're at risk of running the same story again on AI.
Yeah, I agree with you. And in fact, you gave some really great insights on advertising earlier on and also on brand, and we typically move on to advertising chapter now, but I don't think we need to revisit it. Instead, I think if we can, because you're a self-proclaimed nerd, and you've got some interesting insights, let's stay on the AI topic just for a second. One of the things that seems to me to be an issue is that for a young person, particularly perhaps from a low equity background, obviously learning how to use AI is a great tool in increasing their prospects. But a lot of enterprise companies, through limitations or through culture, aren't actually able to incorporate those AI skills into their day-to-day job. And so it feels to me like somebody who is in their early 20s is in their evenings working on AI, but it's not necessarily a transferable skill into a career in an enterprise company. Have you seen, as you're up close with a lot of these large companies, how they feel about AI and incorporating that within their workforce?
Well, I think a lot of large companies outside the tech space currently have not made AI accessible to their own employees. And the reasons for that is often poor adoption understanding, but also concerns regarding data protection. But it's actually completely perverse because these technologies are so powerful that most of the employees of these organizations have their own personal accounts, which they're pulling proprietary company data into, which is far, far more risky than companies actually adopting AI and shaping their use of AI appropriately to kind of mitigate those data risks. So employees are already using AI, even if companies haven't officially rolled it out or not, because it's so powerful. And I think the thing that's going to be really interesting is I think we're starting to get to a point now where we're starting to see AI meaningfully displace existing junior and mid-level jobs. Like, because we're a company that works with a lot of big employers, we see some of this data before it comes out in unemployment figures. Like, we know how many graduates and interns all the companies we're working with are hiring each year. And just to sort of give you a non-specific example, I've had conversations recently with the chair of a major employer in the UK who's essentially said that in part of their organisation there's an activity which a couple of years ago took a grad a week to complete, which now AI can do to a better standard in 10 minutes. Like, what do you think that's going to mean for their graduate intake this year and next year? So I think the concerns regarding unemployment that we haven't seen in 22, 23 and 24, I think in the back end of 2025 and certainly in 2026, we're going to see a big shift on that. I think that's going to be a really important moment because I think right now today, most people in the UK probably see AI as a net positive to their life if they are actually using it. I think we're going to start to see some of these more philosophical questions around employment, displacement start to play out. And it's really important that companies get ahead of that rather than not addressing it and allowing resentment and indeed paranoia to build up in their employee base. Just casting our minds back 150 years, the last time we saw a technological change of this magnitude was the Industrial Revolution. And there was a movement during the Industrial Revolution in the UK, the Luddite movement, where people essentially resisted the implementation of a lot of these new industrial technologies in factories because it was automating their jobs. So literally people were deliberately breaking machines, thwarting processes, and people laugh at it now, and the phrase Luddite has become a kind of like known phrase for describing this. But do not be surprised if a year's time, if companies haven't got ahead of this, you start to see employees deliberately sabotaging AI processes. I think, to make a sort of bold prediction, I think one of the biggest changes we're going to see in the next year is a massive U-turn on the attitudes of employees towards working from home. Today, working from home is seen as a benefit for most companies. It's something employees like. You don't have to take the commute to work. You can build your personal life around your work life. Today, it's employers who are trying to get people back in the office, and it's employees who are saying, I want at least a couple of days a week to work from home. I think that's going to massively U-turn, because working from home in many ways is the ultimate solution for businesses to automate your job. If everyone is working from home asynchronously, it creates a fully end-to-end digital trail which AI can use to automate your job, whether it's recording and transcribing video calls, Slack messages, building processes to take into account that people are working in distributed places rather than the office. Working from home is the perfect recipe for creating clear digital processes that can be automated by AI agents. So my bold prediction is part of this kind of Luddite reaction we're going to get is employees are going to want to get back in the office, because that is a way to almost prevent parts of their job being digitized, because you'll have conversations in rooms like this which aren't recorded, aren't transcribed, conversations in the office which aren't on Slack, and that is a more difficult thing for AI to automate. So that is my kind of bold clickbait prediction on changing attitudes towards working from home. I think that's going to flip the other way around in 2026. Very
interesting. And I know we've spent a little bit of time on this chapter, but I do think it's very current, and it's particularly of interest to the younger generation. If I could just ask you one more thing, if you have a comment on it. When you look at the UK as a geography and its approach to AI, I don't know the in and outs, but as I understand, there's not a great deal of AI companies actually forming in the UK, because energy prices and things like that are quite high compared to elsewhere. And so I have some concerns that when we look at things like social mobility, the UK won't have any governance over who has access to what, because all of the AI services will be coming from elsewhere, from private companies. Do you have any thoughts on, any comment on how the UK is approaching AI generally?
Well, ironically, in some ways, the UK is the birthplace of AI. It's called the Turing Institute for a reason. Some of the the early stage AI innovations in the UK came from academic institutions and innovators based in this country. When you look at a lot of those seminal research papers, they're from UK university, and Oxford and Cambridge in particular pioneered a lot of the AI research which has led to where we are today. Google DeepMind, which published a paper on transformers, which is the kind of the technology and models which all companies are using to produce these large language models, was based in the UK. So the UK is in many ways created the intellectual underpinnings of the AI revolution. But where you see all the action happening now is Silicon Valley, because unfortunately, because the UK still is nowhere near as competitive as the West or East Coast in the US, as soon as these innovations start to be commercialized, everyone wants to do that in America rather than doing it in London. And that is obviously a really sad story for the UK, because all these companies in many ways should be here, because this is the birthplace of AI. But you're completely right. When it comes to that topic of how do we make sure the cost of these AI models is low, that the UK is in a really poor position, because we have the highest industrial energy prices in the OECD. When you look at UK electricity prices for companies versus the US, we're talking 4 or 5 times higher. So unless we solve our energy problem, then we're at risk of creating a massive disparity in who does and doesn't have access to AI in the UK. So when it comes to energy policy, like net zero, in my opinion, is still important, but is a side concern to how do we rapidly reduce energy prices in the UK. If we don't do that in the next couple of years, we're storing up massive issues for the future.
I imagine that you've been working non-stop now since you were 21, and always keen to hear from founders about how you tackle and how you deal with and how you manage burnout. Whether you've experienced it, if you haven't, how you've staved it off. Could you just give us a little bit of an insight into that?
Well, I think that, like a lot of founders, got a strong opinion, like work-life balance is impossible if you want to build a company. Like work-life balance is perfectly possible if you live in or work in a corporate job, but to build something from nothing, like not only do you have to work smarter than everyone else, but you do have to work harder as well, because it is a game of compounding at the end of the day. And compounding isn't just about getting 1% better every day, it's about doing it for a longer period of time. So there's no getting away from the 80-hour weeks if you're a startup founder. I think the key question is, if you're going to be doing 80-hour weeks repetitively for 5 to 10 years, how do you survive doing that? Because the human body and mind, I do not think is optimized to do kind of cognitively intense tasks for 80 hours a week over that period, and that's why we probably have evolved in the Western world having average working hours now between 30 to 40 hours per week. And I think the only way you can get through that is by, one, building a company with a mission that you genuinely emotionally resonate with. If you're just doing it for money, that is a decent motivator, but that is not the thing that is going to get you up in the morning where everything feels like it's going wrong. The thing that's going to get you up in the morning is having that fire in your belly or the chip on your shoulder of building something for a mission that you truly care about. So I think one of the big competitive advantages in having a mission-driven company is not just the kind of brand advantages you get through that, but the personal advantages of almost having a stronger sense of resilience because you genuinely buy into what you're building. So I think that's really important. I mean, I think the other thing as well is you have to pick your priorities. So clearly, if you're starting a company, your career and business is going to be one of your priorities. I think above and beyond that, you can maybe choose one other big thing, and you just have to decide what that is. Like, is it family? Is it having a girlfriend or boyfriend? Is it friends? Like, is it an activity that you particularly like? I think you can have one other big thing alongside having a company. But you can't have 4 or 5 big things. Like, something has to go at the end of the day. It is a trade-off in terms of time. I think it's just a good thing to be clear in your own mind about the trade-off that you're making. If you're not clear in your own mind about that trade-off, you're going to create resentment amongst people. Like, if you decide that you can only see your family maybe 4 or 5 times a year, then go back every weekend, that's fine as long as you're clear about that in your own mind. You've kind of communicated that in some way to the people that you love, that you're not able to do those things anymore. If you don't communicate that, and then you're not answering WhatsApp messages, and like you're not coming back as much as your parents want, that is a recipe for resentment and disaster. So get clear about the choices that you're making. Like in the early days of Zero Gravity, I was a new young person down in London, and my other thing I did is I would just go out with my friends on a Friday and Saturday night and get super drunk. I mean, I loved football as well, so I kind of integrated it with that. So like, that's not the most kind of like romantic second priority and pastime, but I was clear in my mind, I'm going to absolutely stack it and work hard during the week. And then I've got this kind of thing on a Friday evening and Saturday. That is my second passion. So you have to get clear about the trade-offs.
The last chapter, I say the last chapter, the last part we like to talk about, we kind of refer to as long-term strategy, exit strategy, but really what it is from my perspective is, as a founder, as you're building this business and scaling this business, how far ahead are you looking? And what advice would you give to other people building businesses with respect to how far ahead they plan? With a specific emphasis on how much attention you pay to the day that you'll either pass this business on to someone else who builds it or continues to build it, or you sell the business, or any other type of format. Could you give us some insight to how you feel about all of that?
Sure. So I suppose no one invests money in a startup if they don't think there's a route to exit, if people are doing it for economic reasons. So in theory, every startup should have an exit plan. But what that looks like varies for each company. There's quite a nice tool on, I think it's on Deal Room, the website for sort of funding round analytics, that tells you, based on the data it's got about your company in terms of how much money it's raised, what market it's in, revenue numbers, employee numbers. It gives you a sort of prediction of what it thinks the exit outcome is going to be for your company. I looked at that recently. I think for Zero Gravity that the chance of an IPO was less than 1%. And I think the chance of an acquisition was around 25%. So that essentially means the chance of failure, even at the stage we're at now, 74%. So like to be honest with yourself as a founder, the default outcome for most startups is failure. Like there's no getting away from that, which is why the passion point is so important. If you're just building for an exit with no other motivation, you're going to come unstuck, because actually getting to an IPO or an acquisition is incredibly hard. I think it's only when you sort of raise your Series C round that statistically the likelihood of an acquisition rather than a failure tips from one to the other. In terms of how I think about it at Zero Gravity, we're not building for an exit in the short term. My motivation is I want this company to be the category defining company for social mobility, breaking that link between background and opportunity. But philosophically, in the long term, if we built something that I felt did that and was sustainable, and then a strategic acquirer or a private equity company came along and said, no, we want to build this and take it to the next level, and obviously that's something that I would look at, because we've raised £6.5 million of funding, and I owe it to the investors in our company to always consider those sort of options. So an exit is not the sort of thing I'm thinking about day to day. Ultimately, I'm thinking about how do I build a company that ultimately becomes so valuable that people are then interested in acquiring it. And I think that should be the key consideration for startup founders, not mapping what your exit opportunities are, but mapping how do I create this thing to be the most valuable entity it could possibly be. Because if you create something valuable, there will be acquisition opportunities. If you create something that's not very valuable, no amount of analysis of exit opportunities is going to get you that exit that you want at the end of the day.
Getting a little bit longer in the tooth now. You've been doing this for a while. So I'm just wondering, is there any sort of business ideas you've had? This is all a bit off script and random, but I'm just interested. Is there anything that you that's crossed your eye and your mind whilst you've been building Zero Gravity and thought, do you know what, I would actually be interested in exploring that as a business one day as well?
Well, I had all sorts of different ideas when I was growing up and at university. I always wanted to be a tech entrepreneur. That was something I was really passionate about. And one thing that I actually looked into at one point, and I actually made a very small investment into a company that eventually took this idea on, is one of the things I saw at university was there was starting to be a movement away from using the contraceptive pill. That has really accelerated over the past 3 or 4 years, but because of the hormonal downsides, that usage in a lot of the Western world has plateaued. But I still thought it was really weird as a young person, how bad the experience was around buying non-pill based contraception is in the UK. You go to as a nervous 16-year-old, you go to the supermarket and sort of grab some
nervous 33-year-old
and put it in your shopping basket under a loaf of bread. But the experience around contraception is a really bad consumer experience. So my kind of very vague, silly idea is almost like a Harry's razors for customized condoms. And I thought, this is a cool idea, takes away the awful consumer experience about having to buy them, reacts to this market trend around people moving away from pill-based contraception, and builds it into a more kind of romantic and luxury experience where you're getting the made-to-measure stuff in a nice box. And I thought it was a great idea, and I sort of chatted about it with people, friends, looked into it. The thing I didn't realise, and one of the reasons I didn't pursue it other than Zero Gravity, is I didn't realise how regulated this industry is. Clearly, if something goes wrong in the manufacturing of those products, you've got a big issue on your hands. So it's actually really difficult to mass produce those products as a small company because of the amount of regulatory compliance and safety checks you want to do. So like Durex in the UK has a like massive market share and monopoly essentially in the market because of that. So that is an idea which is completely different from zero gravity, like no relation whatsoever, but it was just based on something I had seen myself as a university student, just some of the trends I was seeing amongst young people. So I don't think there's any issue with exploring ideas, no matter how wacky. Like that idea is completely wacky, and I eventually another company came along and did just that, and I put a little bit of money into making that happen because I passionately believed it was actually a good idea and good business. So I'd say in order to like ideate about what sort of business you want to build, it's not Isaac Newton sit under a kind of apple tree and you get hit with an apple and suddenly it all comes out your head. Solve problems that you've actually experienced firsthand. Zero gravity was a problem that I experienced firsthand. The stuff around the like contraceptive was something I saw firsthand at university. Like that is the way to find great ideas, reflecting on your own problems and your solutions for them, not sitting in a sort of a black box expecting the next big thing to suddenly hit you on the head.
And before we wrap up, if we're asking one freestyle question,
go for it.
I have one of my own. You have done such a great job of providing insights and you seem rock solid. You know, a seriously well-accomplished founder with crystal clear insight. What is your biggest weakness?
So I think just to turn it the other way around, like I started with no experience whatsoever and was very naive. So all these insights that I'm spitting out now are the product of 5 or 6 years of actually building something from nothing and not knowing very much. And my biggest advice to founders is always like, you've got to be hyper curious and read prodigiously. I didn't know any of this stuff 5 or 6 years ago. It was only about reading constantly that I was able to actually learn some of these processes and frameworks, which I then applied firsthand and then adapted based on my experience. So like 2 or 3 hours a day as a founder should be spent reading, and that doesn't have to mean sort of sitting with a kind of book in your office. That literally could just mean making sure your Twitter and TikTok feed is full of content relevant to building companies rather than garbage. I think actually the TikTok and Twitter feed I've got, and that being very based around startup, product and tech, is probably just as big as influence on the knowledge I've got than any like individual books I've read. So you've got to be super curious. I think my biggest weakness, other than a lack of experience, is, I know this is very cliche, like a lot of young people coming to startup, I was a perfectionist. Like the academic system teaches you to strive for perfection, because like when you think about how an exam system works, you get a specification, there's a mark between 0 and 100, and your goal is to get as close to 100 like as you can. So I always had that kind of perfectionist optimization mindset, and that was good insofar as it gave me an eye for detail and gave me a kind of sense of high expectations that I try to instill in other people. It was perverse in terms of I spent a lot of time worrying about optimizing what I'd already built than building the next thing. And the thing is, when you're an early stage company, you don't want to get into optimization mode because actually you don't have something worth having yet. So you need to constantly be thinking about, how do I build the next thing? How do I make this better? Not how do I kind of optimize this button to the nth degree or optimize this policy to the nth degree. So I think that perfectionist mindset that came out of academia was bad in terms of instilling an optimization mindset. I almost had to train myself out of that and move to what crudely is more of a fuck it mindset. Let's do this even though it's not perfect, completely well defined, in order to escape some of those bad practices. So I know it's a cliched answer, but actually for young people, I think it's the biggest barrier to success. People's academic mindset forces a lot of young founders to spend years iterating on PowerPoint decks and plans rather than just getting stuff out there and learning whilst doing. And I almost fell into that trap as well.
It's interesting that you mentioned content. I mean, there is a rise in this kind of content at the moment, particularly to do with social mobility. The rise of Gary Stevenson, for example, his stuff is everywhere. I'm just wondering if you have any sort of opinions on that.
Hang on, we've lost a camera. 1 second.
It's a bit hot.
It's a bit hot?
Yes.
Okay, well, we've still got the camera on, Joe, so
If you want to answer that question, it's just something that I find.
Yeah.
Do you know why? The reason
Carry
the reason
on.
I find that interesting is because, you know, what you've done is something that's incredible, and what you're doing is you're turning around and saying this should be replicable, but it's very hard to replicate it. So let's make it easier to replicate. You know, whereas sort of the Gary Stevenson model is very much like, I've done this thing, it's not possible for anyone else to do it, therefore the system is fucked. So I'm just wondering whether or not you find that type of messaging, and I'm paraphrasing and I'm making sort of generalizations about what he's saying, but I'm wondering if you find that sentiment, does it help or hinder the social mobility course that you're trying to tackle?
The thing I like about Gary Stevenson is his style and way of talking, because it's not often that you see people from working class backgrounds on podcasts or in the news, and he speaks in a way which I think is very down to earth, punchy, but also packed with insight as well. So I like the kind of stylistic way of how he presents himself. The thing I don't like is the fatalism. Like, a lot of his diagnosis of the system is correct, but I think then mapping that into a fatalism of that I did it, I'm an outlier, and it's impossible for you to do it. I think that is a message which just fills people with depression rather than gives them a sense that they can go out and do it. Like, of course, social mobility is really hard, but it's not impossible, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of all the young people out there from low opportunity backgrounds don't think they've got any chance of making it. So I think the fatalism of his message is actually deeply damaging if young people see that. I think they've not got no chance of getting into university or getting into a investment bank. But what I do like is the style, because I think podcast culture in particular has kind of led people to all adopt the same mannerisms, phraseologies, anecdotes. So like when you watch a lot of these podcasts, it's sort of cookie cutter messaging delivered in the same way. And what I do like about Gary is he's very different and unique from anything else. And that's why most people seeing it for the first time sit on the edge of their chair and think, oh, this guy has a different perspective on the world. So I'd encourage more people to try and almost be themselves, don't polish your accent, don't fall into the same cliches as everyone else. He says after saying perfectionism was his worst weakness, and just try and create a bit of differentiation, because like you have to stand for something to be noticed, and not everything Gary stands for I agree with, but at least he stands for something at the end of the day.
Totally.
I like that.
Awesome. What a savage conversation.
Yeah, amazing.
Really, really great talking to you. Thank you very much.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you so much.